think we're live. Pretty sure. Let's double check here. Let's see. Maybe. It looks like we're live, but hang on, I gotta double check my audio here. Yep. Okay. So I apologize in advance for the lighting situation here. It's not ideal. I mean, that's, first world problems having an office with a beautiful window that's south facing, but you end up with contrasting lighting. But I'm not a videographer, so this is the best I can do. I get a nice mic here and an office space with the door so I can host these live Q&As. So this is the first of what hopefully will be iterative each semester of a live stream anthropology questions and answers session, a live Q&A. I have asked my students at Cuyahoga Community College to send in questions, and I am here to answer them. For those watching, because I don't actually know who's watching right now, I just have a list of people who are watching. I'm Professor Eric Olson. I teach anthropology courses here at Cuyahoga Community College, although for short we generally call it Tri-C. So this semester I'm teaching human evolution and archaeology. So most of the questions I'm going to be answering today are going to be anthropology specific to human ev and archaeology, because those are what I'm teaching. Now I did get a bunch of questions beforehand, so I asked people to send in questions. If you're not in my class, or you're a student who's taking other classes at Tri-C but want to take my class, or want to ask a question but aren't in my class, you can send a message or ask your question to tricanthropology@gmail.com, which that's all one continuous TRIC anthropology@gmail.com. Sorry, I forget I'm mirrored, so I want to do it the other way, but then anyway, I'm looking at an image of myself to pull back the curtain, so to speak. So there's a lot of questions to cover and not a lot of time to do it, because I'm trying to keep these to 60 minutes or less. If you happen to watch this after the fact, you can fast forward my voice, but we're going to get into it with the questions. So I've ordered these questions that students have asked in the order in which I received them. So if I don't get to your question before we run out of time, then I will do it in the next live stream. So if you'll notice when you're on the channel, it says there's a live stream today. And there's another one on December 7th. I think, yeah, December 7th, which is the next Thursday. And then one more for this year on December 14th, all at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, or Daylight Savings Time, EDT, one or the other. But these are going to be happening. There's 3 of them for the rest of this year. Next semester, my schedule is going to be different, so it probably won't be Thursdays at 11. So you'll have to stay tuned and look at the live stream schedule to see when the questions will be answered next semester. And the semester starts January 14th, or is it the 19th? Sometime in mid-January. You would think I would know this off the top of my head, but I don't. Actually, sorry, the 14th of, no, that's December. So probably like the 15th or the 16th of January would be the week that we start this back up again with questions, although very likely I won't have a lot of questions because of the holidays, and then also students won't have questions to ask at the start of the semester. So with that being said, do I have the chat on? I might not have the chat on. Well, in any event, the questions I have, we're going to start first with Harris, and Harris asks the following question. My question today is about pursuing a career in anthropology. What level of education is typically required of an anthropologist? Do you need a master's degree to be considered successful in the discipline? So that's what Harris's question is. Thank you, Harris, for your question. So in a nutshell, anthropology is, at least in America, this 4-subfield discipline of archaeology, physical anthropology, or human evolution, if you're in my human evolution class, linguistics, and cultural did I totally forget my list before I finished it? Cultural, linguistics, archaeology, physical anthropology. Those 4. Generally speaking, in the United States, it depends on what you want to do with your degree. So if you're looking to become a successful anthropologist academically, then you probably need a master's or a PhD at the very least. If you're looking to just do sort of contract-based archaeology, which that's where the bulk of anthropology majors are employed, it's in an industry we call cultural resource management, so CRM for short. So CRM is where I would say probably 99.9% of anthropology majors end up getting a job in after they graduate. So these are contract archaeologists. I say contract in the sense of you get hired to do a job, a project-based jobs. We actually have one coming up on a nonprofit I'm on, where we have to go out and survey some farm fields, in December. Not ideal, but that's the job, and that's the project-based aspect of it. A lot of it's also report writing, so technical report writing is super critical for someone who wants to be a successful anthropologist, whether you're doing archaeology or you're doing ethnography. Medical anthropology is another big market right now. I was just talking to someone the other day, a publisher representative for one of our textbooks, and we were both joking that medical anthropology is sort of the hot, fashionable thing to do right now, is to hire medical anthropologists in your departments. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the medical industry is very profitable right now. I mean, there's a lot of things to unpack with the idea of medicine being so profitable. Is that ethical? Why is there a marketplace for that sort of thing? But leaving that aside, because medicine is such a large industry and a large job, can I say words? Large job market. Sorry, I'm making myself laugh. It's never good when you're just doing questions by yourself without any interactivity in a live stream. But because it's such a large job market, you'll see a lot of anthropology majors, especially if you're going to a place like Case Western, which is close to us here at Tri-C, have medical anthropology programs. And what you'd be doing there is sort of being a liaison between patients and doctors. Medical anthropology isn't learning how to diagnose or treat diseases, but more looking at the social aspects of disease and prevention, education, and communication. So you might run into a medical anthropology situation where you're looking at clean drinking water. That's not necessarily like a doctor's perspective would say, oh, well, you need to have clean drinking water to prevent cholera. But a medical anthropologist would go in and do field work to understand, well, why are people still getting cholera? And is this a problem that's not directly related to, well, it's not that they don't understand that, dirty water is going to get them cholera. It's that they might be making, tough economic decisions between getting fresh fruit and vegetables and fresh meats over fresh water, because the risk of getting cholera are much lower than the risk of getting foodborne illness. And I would rather spend my money on getting fresh, meats and produce than investing that in fresh water, because the risk is lower in one than the other. So that's just a hypothetical scenario about medical anthropology. Now that you probably would want to get a master's degree to be successful, but I would say in general you can usually be okay with an associate's or bachelor's. Now if you want to do archaeology, an associate's right now, the most important thing I would say is if you have a field school. So we're going to be teaching one, it's all plugs for the classes I teach, but next summer in 2024 we're going to be teaching Archaeological Field Methods, Anthro 2030, and having that class under your belt will make you very hireable, because right now the market is very hot for field technicians, which are basically archaeologists who go out and do the field work. These are the people that walk up and down the fields, dig holes, inventory artifacts, write reports. There's just not enough of them going around, and so we need more field archaeologists. So I would say no, you don't need to have a master's degree to be successful in anthropology. That was a very long, winding way to get to your answer, Harris. So hopefully I answered it for you. And I think there's a couple other questions in here that students were asking that I think are in the same vein. But for the sake of time, I'm trying to budget myself 5 minutes at most per question, and I think I hit that on the head. 5 minutes, I'm pretty sure. So we're going to move on to Noor, who has 3 different questions, all packed into one set of one email, I guess I should say. But Noor asks, can you please further explain the mitochondria Eve gene? Sorry, I was about to read my response that I had already boilerplated beforehand. But yeah, so to reiterate, the question is, can you please further explain the mitochondria Eve gene? So what Noor is talking about, for those who might not be in the know, is mtDNA, or mitochondrial DNA. In your cells, you have, so every cell in your body that has mitochondrial DNA. The mitochondria, perhaps this is dating myself as a millennial, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, producing lots of different proteins and contributing to processing ATP and all that good stuff. I might be getting that wrong. I'm not a cellular biologist, but point being that there is a type of DNA in mitochondria called mitochondrial DNA. Now, the tricky thing with mitochondrial DNA is that it's only passed down by mothers to their children. So I have my mother's mitochondrial DNA, but I will not pass down any of my mitochondrial DNA to my children. The only mitochondrial DNA that is passed on is by the mother or the female in the reproductive unit or the offspring. So the reason mitochondrial DNA, there's two things I guess you could say are the reason why mitochondrial DNA is so important and why we sort of call it the Eve gene. One, the Eve gene is a biblical reference, not my choice, but someone who was developing this back in the mid to late 20th century, so like the 70s and 80s, was looking at mitochondrial DNA, realizing that it's only passed down through females. Thus, they say we can be able to trace the most recent common ancestor, which we would call Eve. So we're able to interpret when the last common ancestor of all humans was in time. And there's two reasons that mitochondrial DNA is relevant for genetic studies. One is the rate at which it mutates. So during the 70s and 80s, through statistical analysis of cellular organisms and mitochondria, these biologists were able to determine that mitochondria mutates at a rate much faster than human DNA, regular, I guess you could say, everyone has DNA. I don't know why I said human DNA, but DNA. And that's important for dating sort of sequences in time, especially in the human evolution lineage, because you don't want to have something that can change really fast, but you also don't want to have something that changes really slow. So if it changes too slowly, you're not going to be able to say anything meaningful. If it takes 4 million years for DNA to mutate, which it doesn't, but or I guess a better example might be geological time. So the strata of soils takes a really long time, so you might be looking at millions of years. So you're getting a really coarse-grained change in time. That might not be super useful if you're trying to ask something about one particular species within that 4 million year block. The other end of the spectrum is true. If something changes really rapidly and doesn't have a long shelf life, then you can't really go far back in time. So this is the case with radiocarbon dating, and it only goes back 50,000 years because you need to have carbon in order to radiocarbon date. And if the half-life of carbon is, I don't know exactly what it is off the top of my head, but point being, you won't have any carbon left after about 50,000 years or so, meaning if we wanted to date something that's older than 50,000 years ago, there won't be any carbon for us to radiocarbon date. And so it decays too fast for us to use in human evolution studies. But it's great for archaeological studies of the more recent past. I know it seems weird to say recent for anything 50,000 years or less, but there you go. So the rate at which mitochondria changes is really useful for dating evolutionary changes, and then also knowing that it's passed down through mothers means you're able to more specifically look at mitochondrial DNA of females. So you only have to deal with half the population in your sample size when you're analyzing patterns. So you could just look at mitochondrial DNA similarities of living human females and use that to sort of trace, knowing how long it takes for mitochondrial DNA to mutate. You can make a statistical estimation. So when we say Eve is a person, yes, it's the most recent common ancestor, but it's sort of an abstraction. It's like this person exists, but we don't know what their name was. We don't know what their life was like. We don't know where they lived. We just know approximately when they lived, and that this is the ancestor that we all share in common. It's not to say that they were Genghis Khan and they reproduced so many people that they are connected to everyone. It's more just a case of their DNA, mitochondrial DNA, is connected to everyone else is in the human lineage, and so they are the most recent common ancestor for all humans. The next question that Noor asks is, why did Homo erectus leave Africa? Now, if I can answer this one succinctly in 5 minutes, shoot, I'd be working on my PhD right now if that were the case at the University of Tokyo or something. I don't know. But this is a question that many anthropologists spend their entire careers trying to answer. And so the long and short of it is, humans left Africa for a variety of reasons that we are mostly leaning on. Now, this one's probably dated because I've tried to brush up on the literature as much as I can, but I'm not necessarily like knee deep in the most up-to-date cutting-edge research. But a common interpretation of why humans left Africa is following and hunting game. So basically tracking the herd migrations of other animals that might have crossed land bridges out of Africa, most likely in the Sinai Peninsula, hundreds of thousands of years ago, and leaving Africa and following these herds of large game to hunt, or even if you might just be following a herd of woolly mammoth, which maybe woolly mammoth isn't a good example, but these large animals, you'd be following them, not necessarily hunting them, but waiting for an opportunity for one of them to die, and then you go and get them, or they get stuck in the mud, and then they're an easy kill. And so following the herd migrations of these animals means that you might be leaving Africa, and then once you leave Africa, you might be exploiting new resources, adapting to new environments, new climates, and expanding from there. Some people have pushed back this argument, saying that herd migrations only account for so much movement of the human species. Like, it's not going to explain why people went all the way to Australia, but it does explain the initial leaving Africa, and then from there it gets complicated because then you have people moving into Western Europe, into Central Eurasian steppe, Asia, Southeast Asia, and Oceania. So there's lots of different, and then obviously eventually the Americas. But there's lots of interpretations about why humans left Africa, but that seems to be the most common one. Now, whether or not humans were hunting or scavenging, now that's an even more difficult debate that anthropologists are still working out right now. I think early humans were more scavengers is the general consensus, but by like Homo erectus, it's clearly more towards hunting than scavenging. And then the last question that Noor has here is, how did the early hominins craft such detailed tool-making techniques? I know the tools exemplify their capabilities and intelligence, but it's shocking they created such intricate techniques with steps. So in order to explain this question, I'm actually going to switch displays and go over to my Okio-cam. Okay. Oh. And then for some reason, it's only showing part of it. Okay, yeah, we're good. Sorry, I'm just double checking here. So let's adjust this. So what you're looking at here is not actually a bunch of Paleolithic or even early stone tools. These are probably less than 7,000 years old, and these are from Ohio. But they were what I was able to grab in the time before class started. And so looking at them, it's probably hard to tell in this lighting, so maybe I'll get some oblique lighting here. And you might be able to see, because I know we've talked about this with some of our labs with stone tools. Ooh, that's actually you can see the ripples there, the stone tool. This is one of the reasons why illustration is so important in archaeology still, is because a photo just doesn't do justice to stone tools, and it's really hard to see those ripples. But this edge right here has been reworked into a scraper, and really it boils down to, when you're making a stone tool, it seems daunting until you start flint knapping, and then you start thinking like a flint napper. So right away, having flint knap before, I know that this is the platform that they struck it off of a larger piece. So if you can imagine it, if this were a core, boom, flaked it off there. So this is actually probably the former edge, if you can sort of see that right there, the former edge of a blade of a biface. So these are bifaces, right? So probably more likely what happened was something like this. And if I were to strike it right here, you can see how it would be similar to, maybe you can't see it, but you can sort of see right here is a lip, and that lip is actually from the former edge. So this is one side of the biface, and this is the dorsal side of the other. Not of this actual biface, but a lot of people prehistorically were making bifaces because they're sort of this catch-all. You can make flake tools with them conveniently. They work pretty well as a cutting edge. If you want to use them as a scraper, turn them into a drill. And really, these complicated tool technologies, what's nice about stone tools is that they seem complex, and they oftentimes are, but stone is predictable and reliable in the sense of when you strike a stone at a certain angle with a certain application of force, you can work it into something like this, a crude biface, which you could then maybe make this into a stone drill like this. And that's different than working other pieces of stone where, because of the fracture mechanics, you can't actually manipulate the material the way you want. So sort of like how a woodworker can make it pretty much any shape they want out of carving, the same thing's true of stone. Obviously a much harder material, so it's going to last a lot longer because it's more predictable. So I can make these shapes out of stone when I know how to strike them at certain angles and certain forces. And so, the long and short of it is, how do they make these complex tool making techniques? They pass them down just like oral traditions or oral histories, learning from example and just getting experienced. I would say experienced flint knapper might take 20 years to hone their craft, but that's true of a lot of crafts. You might spend a decade or more learning how to make these stone tools. Like, I'm not a great flint knapper. I probably couldn't make a scraper this nice, even though to a professional stone tool manufacturer, this scraping edge, which they basically just made a quick little cutting edge on both sides of this, could probably do in a few minutes. And I might be able to make something like this if there's a pre-existing biface, but getting to this point can be tricky because you're removing a lot of material. So sort of like in maybe art classes, you might think of schools of art techniques and whatnot. You'd have people teaching you how to make stone tools, and you just trial and error, maybe losing digits in the process, and accidentally cutting them while working on stone tools. But that's in essence what I'm talking about here. Is predictability of the material is the most important thing. And once humans discovered that certain rock types like flint and chert, and then once you have an eye for them, once you know what you're looking for, it's sort of like you can't unsee it. And then you can find chert and flint anywhere, and these are all geologically, we just call all these chert, but if you want to call them flint, you can call them flint too. Okay, now we're out of that. We're going to move on to Sherry's question. And Sherry's question is, I guess I should read it, is, one of the questions I would like to ask is pertaining to the recent bus trip, October 19th, 2023, to the Museum of Psychology. Were there any outstanding notes of interest that could be shared with those who weren't able to attend? So what Sherry is talking about is on October 19th, students were able to, I promoted this, it wasn't an event I hosted or put on, but down in Akron there is the Cummins Center for the History of Psychology, and then on the fourth floor of that institution is the Institute for Human Sciences and Culture, and both of them were having programming on the same night. So the Center for the History of Psychology is actually a Smithsonian affiliate, and if I switch to it here, hang on, I have the web pages for them. Alright, brace yourself for entering the matrix. Boom! As you get a mirrored image. So the Cummins Center for the History of Psychology is the National Museum of Psychology, based in Akron, affiliated with the Smithsonian. So there was some programming where you could walk around and visit the museum and see their displays. I think they had an exhibit on houselessness and also on institutional insane asylums from the 19th century. I guess Beyond the Picket Fence, that's the one that I was just describing about houseless communities around the country and the history of them. And then on the fourth floor was the Institute for Human Science and Culture. There is a sexology exhibit that was there. There is the Oak Native American Gallery. So basically, actually, let's click on this. Basically, what the programming consisted of was visiting the Oak Native American Gallery and learning about different cultures across North America and looking at certain cultural objects from these communities that weren't typically on display. So if you were to go to this exhibit at any other time, you would see these materials, but some of the materials that they displayed were like masks that they have in their curation house, but they don't display on a regular basis. So there were some interesting things. The only thing I would note, and this obviously only applies to people that are in Northeast Ohio, so if you're listening and you're not in Northeast Ohio, then this might not be relevant to you, but hey, maybe you'll make a trip to Akron. We have an airport. You could also fly in from Cleveland, so come check it out. The current exhibit, let's see if I can't find it. It's by Peter Jones, and I thought it was a very good exhibit. Yeah, here it is. Obituary by Peter Jones. And it's focusing on sort of missing indigenous persons on reservations, and it's Peter Jones is member of the Seneca Nation of Indians, and he lives in western New York, and he makes pottery, as you can see here, in the style of Iroquois pottery that we find on archaeological sites. So he's merging a lot of the past with the present in the sort of artwork that he does. This is a really cool exhibit. Highly recommend checking it out if you happen to have a chance of visiting the Cummins Center for the History of Psychology. And now you can't see anything. There we go. And I'm back. Sorry, there's no fancy fades or anything like that, so it's mostly just so that I can have something recorded for students and give synchronous, or maybe not synchronous. I guess this would be asynchronous because you guys wrote your questions in beforehand. So hopefully, Sherry, that gives you some sense of what you missed out on October 19th. There will be other programming in the future at the Cummins Center, but and the Institute for Human Sciences and Culture, but I don't know what those are because I'm not in charge of them. But I would recommend you check out those websites to learn more about them, and go check out the museum on a day that something's not happening, because it's still a really, really nice museum. I mean, they've got, one of the cool things that I remember when we went there was they had like a little activity where like Babe Ruth was tested on his dexterity, and he had to like tap a button a number of times, and you could test your ability to, are you faster than Babe Ruth in tapping a button or something like that, because the point being he has like faster reflexes and response time. That's what makes him a great baseball player or something like that. And there's like a whole sports science section that's pretty interesting. And related to anthropology, there was a section about studying non-human primates that also seems really relevant to those of you who are studying human evolution. They talked briefly, I think, about Washoe, who's a very famous example of teaching language to a chimpanzee. I think he signed this for Washoe. I think this is W, so he would do this to indicate his name. And Washoe learned a couple hundred words, I want to say. And then of course there's Coco the gorilla, who learned 300 some signs back in the 70s and 80s, and sadly Coco passed away in 2019, I think. She lived to be like 44 or something like that. Highly recommend, if you don't know about Coco, that's Koko, go look up Coco. Adorable. One of the contentious things, and I guess this is where anthropology gets into debates. The contentious things about Coco is that some people argue that she didn't actually display emotion or communicate in the same way that humans communicate. But I forget who was, I think her name was Penny, but the person who was in charge of taking care of Coco said that when Coco, one of her first cats, died, because Coco had cats, she had her own pets, she basically had a little apartment that people would go and visit, like Mr. Rogers visited Coco, Robin Williams visited Coco, lots of people went and hung out with Coco. But when her first cat passed away, Coco made the sign for water. I don't remember what the sign for water is, but put the sign for water beside her eye, sort of suggesting that she was saying, I'm sad, I'm crying, because she didn't have a word for crying or sad, I don't believe. So she invented a new word. And so the argument was she inventing a new word, or was she mimicking? But suffice to say, I think Coco is still a great, um, interesting ape. So I guess pun intended. Coco was a great ape, literally a gorilla. There I am, making myself laugh again. Anyway, let's carry on with the next question. All that to say, shout out to Coco the gorilla. I was sad when Coco passed, because Coco was an important part of my education in anthropology. So it was sad to see Coco pass. But anyway, Coco, very interesting gorilla. So we're gonna move on to Sophie's questions. Sophie has 3 questions here, and Sophie's first question is, how have advancements in technology such as DNA analysis influenced the field of archaeology? So we kind of touched on that with the mtDNA in Noor's question. Was it Noor's question? Yes. But DNA analysis has, I would say, greatly impacted archaeology in the broadest brushstrokes, the biggest expanses of time. Because like I said, DNA sort of bridges this gap of, it allows us to create dates for things that we otherwise might not be able to date with traditional methods like radiocarbon dating, potassium argon dating, or with dendrochronology. Sorry, I was drawing a blank there. But DNA, it can also be contentious. It's useful for things like deep time human lineage questions, like who was the last common ancestor for all females, who was the last common ancestor for all males, which I didn't touch on with the mtDNA, but the same concept applies, but with males as opposed to females, because they can only pass on Y chromosomes and females can't. So any Y chromosomes you pass on to future males will be passed on. And so the last common ancestor are Y chromosomes. The same concept applies. Does not mean that the last common ancestor, the Y chromosome, mated with the last common ancestor of mtDNA. That is not what those mean. They're just sort of statistical abstractions, statistical sort of like how the average doesn't always exist in reality. It's taken from a set of data. Same's true of Eve, and the Y chromosome equivalent is known as Adam. But DNA has been contentious in the sense that we can start to look at genetic relationships that might relate to culture, so looking at how people are related. Certainly, people are doing the 23andMe and Ancestry.com, like the spit tests, DNA testing, which I think from a cultural perspective, because I also teach cultural anthropology, but I didn't teach it this semester, I think from a cultural perspective, DNA tests and DNA studies kind of promote this idea of sort of, I don't want to say it promotes racial ideology, but it definitely doesn't promote cultural upbringings in the same way that lived experiences can. Because it's one of those classic cases of in my family, we talk about like, oh well, we're English and Welsh and Norwegian and Swedish, but looking at the history and lineage of my ancestors, I mean, most of them came over in the 1600s, so practically 400 years on North America. So at what point can I just say I'm American? Culturally speaking, I don't speak Swedish, I don't speak Welsh, I haven't been in Welsh culture. So it creates these complicated questions of, your DNA says where you came from, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's what you should identify as. And I think that's where the sort of double-edged sword with DNA tests come in, is that they're really useful for understanding human lineage and human ancestry, but from a cultural perspective, my ancestors being from Sweden 400 years ago does not mean I should feel any obligation to say I'm Swedish in even the slightest. But then there's also the issue of DNA testing on willing participants, in the sense of, you're voluntarily offering up your spit, but a lot of DNA tests, when they're done on human ancestors, who are the rightful descendants who have a say in can you extract DNA? So this becomes an issue, especially in the Americas, when you have Native American communities that do not want their ancestors getting desecrated in their eyes for DNA testing, And so it's this question of, do you dig up bones to then do a DNA test? And I think, at least in the Americas, it's much more complicated because of the lineage, or not lineage, the legacy of colonialism, and how a lot of museums still have human skeletal remains of indigenous peoples and have not returned them, and continue to hold them, claiming that they need them for scientific purposes. So there's a lot of moving parts when you talk about DNA. But I think the overall benefits that it's had for archaeology are for much deeper time questions. Now, when we start talking about things within the last like 10,000 years, I think they can get a little complicated, and they can sort of lose the forest for the trees, in the sense that some questions are useful from a genealogical perspective, but they don't necessarily tell you about your culture. Like the way I speak today has nothing to do with how my ancestors in Sweden spoke 400 years ago. So very much my cultural upbringing has a lot to do with American history as opposed to Swedish history. I don't know why I keep coming back to Sweden, but it's just to illustrate a point. So yeah, DNA, I'm just going to leave it there for DNA. I could keep going on, but I don't want to belabor it, and I want to get to some of these other questions. The one problem with the live stream is that I'm constantly talking, and I should probably, for future episodes at like the 11:30 mark, I should probably take like a 60-second break just to take a sip of water or something, which I'm going to do right now. I don't have any ad copy or anything like that because this is just free and for the benefit of students. So, take like 60 seconds to, kick back. If you're watching this after the fact, just fast forward 60 seconds. Okay. All right. I've had my sip of tea and my free promotion for Tri-C. If you're not currently enrolled for classes for spring 2024, I guess that's my ad copy, right? I should do a plug for Tri-C. Duh. Like, advertise for my classes. I could just be like, take Anthro 2010, take Peoples and Cultures, where we talk about, ethnographic research and cultures from around the world. That's an idea. Maybe I'll do some pre-recorded ad copy that I can throw into these live streams. Sorry, that's sounding very entrepreneurial of me, but I really enjoy teaching these classes, so why not promote them? Anyway, let's get back into the questions. So we left off with answering one of Sophia's questions. Did I say Sophie or Sophia? I can't remember now. Well, if I said Sophie, I'm apologizing now. I should have said Sophia. So Sophia asked 3 questions. I answered one of them. We're getting back into it. So question number 2 from Sophia is, what ethical considerations should archaeologists keep in mind when conducting excavations and analyzing artifacts? I kind of touched on this before the break about the ethical concerns, especially for something like DNA. Now, I would say in North America, this is more of an issue. That's a weird way of saying it. I think the differences of ethics have to do a lot with colonial legacies and colonial baggage. In a place like Germany, where Germans have been living there for thousands of years, and the people that they're digging up are Germans, and the people doing the digging are Germans, I think it's a much less complicated ethical matter. It becomes ethically dubious when you have someone like myself, who, as I already mentioned before the break, has ancestry in Western Europe and Northern Europe, but has no indigenous heritage doing a dig in North America. And I think the ethical considerations are respecting the past life ways of people and respecting modern cultures and their wishes. So In North America, that oftentimes means initiating conversations with tribes. So there are legal processes for consultation, and then there are informal channels. I think, it's more common to have the formal channels because of legal reasons. So that includes things like the Native Americans Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. It's a mouthful, but it's short for NAGPRA, NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was passed in 1990, basically requiring anyone who has federal money in their project, which is where you'll find with most archaeology in the U.S., anytime federal monies, lands, or permits are involved, you're going to have archaeologists involved in some way, shape, or form. And so as a result of that, anytime you have federal monies involved in the curation of human remains or the identification of human remains, you need to assess that impact with descendant communities. Because oftentimes what will happen is you might find an unmarked grave, and that's someone's ancestors, much in the same way we might have abandoned cemeteries for European ancestors, and we have a procedure for how to dig those people up if we need to. And oftentimes what it boils down to is, in this day and age in archaeology, we're moving more and more towards the easiest ethical solution to sort of questions of who has the rights to own these artifacts, who has the rights to, and I noticed I said artifacts. Human remains do not fall under that category. No one owns human remains. Human remains, at least under English common law, which is where the U.S. gets its law derived from, which is from thousands of years ago in England. But suffice to say, human remains cannot be owned. So you can possess human remains, like they can be in a coffee can, sadly in some cases, as I've seen happen, not with my own eyes, but has happened with people who collect on farm fields and they find human remains and they put them in coffee cans. You can possess them, but that doesn't mean you have the right to own them. And ownership, what that entails is buying and selling. So like if you intend to sell them to another person or buy them from another person, you can't do that legally. So the ethical considerations and the way you sort of avoid having to even confront those issues is to leave artifacts in place and basically no dig. And this has been building since like the 70s. Edward Leip, I don't actually know how you pronounce his name, Lipe, since the 70s has had this term called the conservation ethic. And basically, if you can leave an artifact in place or avoid it, that's the best solution, because you can't excavate twice. It's the one big paradox of archaeology. In order to get data, you have to destroy data. I can't dig a site 2 times in a row. Once I dig it once, it's destroyed. And what I captured in my notes is what I captured. Anything I didn't capture in my notes, it's gone. And so knowing that archaeological resources are non-renewable, the best method to preserve them and protect them and to avoid these ethical issues is to not dig them. So oftentimes on projects, like for next summer, our dig, I'm looking for a village site in the Rocky River Reservation, which is in West Cleveland. The research methodology, basically, we don't want to collect artifacts because they're costly to store, it takes time to inventory them, and it doesn't necessarily build on any information that we couldn't already get from the dig itself. So really, we only need to dig as much as we need to answer the questions that we have to ask. So I don't need to dig up an entire village site if my whole thesis is, or my whole research question is, where is the village site? Once I've identified enough information that I can say, oh, this is a village site, like I don't need to dig the entire thing to know it's a village site, right? Just sort of like the tip of an iceberg. Like, that there's more of the iceberg underneath it, so I don't need to see the whole iceberg to know that there's a lot more of the iceberg. Same in archaeology. You only need to dig enough to make a reasoned conclusion, and if you have a representative sample, and then you draw those conclusions, whether they're regulatory in the case of, can we put our highway here? Well, no, move it over 300 feet. Or in the case of next summer's field school, where, if we're trying to find a village site, once you have enough info to say that that's the village site, there's no reason to keep digging, because you run the risk of having to collect these artifacts, having to do consultation, having to assess, if you run into human remains. And the less digging you do, the less chances you have to run into human remains, right? So that's sort of where the ethics, I would say, are moving right now in the field. That's not to say that people don't dig anymore. It's just to say that oftentimes the easiest solution to those ethical concerns is to just not dig. Because also, if you're just digging for the sake of finding cool stuff, then you're no different than someone who's collecting artifacts because they're pretty. So there has to be some sort of research design behind it, and oftentimes research designs don't require you to dig up a whole lot. So that's sort of the ethical considerations that archaeologists try to keep in mind is, who are the descendant communities, who are the stakeholders. So the stakeholders can also be like, if it's metro parks, then metro parks would be a stakeholder, but then also members of the public, people who would be walking in metro parks are stakeholders. If it's, say you're excavating, I know down in the Akron area, there was a metro park that was excavating a former segregated community that was redlined out of the city of Akron, and so this was a large black community that was in this metro park. So they identified one of the stakeholders as a church that most of these people went to. Now this was a community that was like, I want to say it was from like the teens and 20s. So many of the people that lived there had passed on, but their children and grandchildren were still alive, and they were still members of that church. So they looped that church into the conversation in a dialogue of saying, hey, we're excavating this site where your ancestors lived. We want you to be involved in the process, interpretation, learning from your history, because they probably have information about those sites that archaeologists otherwise wouldn't have. They have stories about, oh yeah, I remember visiting my grandma at that house. It's no longer there, but I can tell you like why we would have, like, there's a dog burial in the backyard if you're going to run into it, kind of thing. So oftentimes it's identifying stakeholders and people who you should be consulting with and getting their opinion on. And that's where a lot of the ethical considerations lie. All right, I've only got 2 more questions for this live stream session. I think I had like 1 or 2 other ones come in like way last minute. So I think for the next one, what I'm going to try and do is have a cutoff date of, if you don't get it to me by at least 12 hours in advance, because I need to be able to prepare for some of these questions. I prepared for a few of them, but I wasn't able to prepare for all of them because there were just so many of them, which is a happy surprise. But I'm going to have to just have a cutoff for them in the future. So I only have 2 more today, and then that'll be the end of it. So this next one is still a question from Sophia, and it is, what role did trade play in making cultural exchanges among ancient civilizations? Yeah, so this question, it's sort of, to unpack this question is to unpack sort of archaeological theory and the history of archaeological studies. Basically, trade, for a long time, there were simple interpretations of the past that included, oh gosh, why am I blanking on it? I should have wrote down the term. Diffusion. There is the word. Came to me. So this would be what we would call diffusionist. That's not to say it doesn't, but I think oftentimes archaeologists from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even the 70s, I mean, some archaeologists even today still fall in the camp of diffusionist archaeology. But that's only one way of explaining culture exchange and culture change. Basically, the idea being culture A is right here, and culture B is over here, and culture B migrates into culture A's area, and that's how we get culture C, is because B moved into A. Obviously, there's complexities of genetics, so families might be moving, so when objects move, people might also be moving. So when people move, those objects are going to change. And then there's also just linguistics differences, so, having 2 cultures that might have similar creation myths, but in different languages, so you might have sort of tweaks in how that creation myth is passed on and what are significant symbolic elements to it. So maybe instead of having a thunderbird mythological creature, you might have a serpent, but the overarching story is the same. So trade, basically, trade allows for this cross-cultural exchange of materials that passes through lots of hands. So it is just one means by which material culture can move rapidly. And in fact, when we look at the archaeological record, oftentimes trade is usually the go-to default assumption for any object that is really, really far away. So like in the case of the Ohio Hopewell, there are artifacts from Flint Ridge, Ohio, which is the state mineral of Ohio, if you didn't know, which is a stone tool, which this one that I was holding up earlier is made out of Flint Ridge material. But this flint was found all the way out in Wyoming, and bear's teeth from Wyoming were found all the way in Chillicothe, Ohio. And so archaeologists have speculated, was this a single trip because there's so few items? Was this just one person making their way all the way out to Wyoming and back? Or was this demonstrating a sustained relationship between people all the way out in Wyoming and Ohio? And I think really it just boils down to illustrating how fast things can move with trade. There's also, from a historical perspective, Lewis and Clark traded axes and medallions on their trip from St. Louis to Seattle or Oregon. I think it was Oregon. I don't know, somewhere in the northwest coast. And by the time they got to Idaho, the axes they had traded at the Mississippi River in what is today St. Louis, there was a tribe that had been cutting down trees for weeks, and they said, "Oh, thank goodness you guys are here. We could use some new axes." Basically, the point being that the axes traveled faster than Lewis and Clark did because of the trade networks that were existing at the time. And so trade networks, they communicate ideas, and it just creates one more layer of complication when we're looking at cultural studies and archaeological studies, because you can have an idea that is exchanged via trade, like in the sense of symbolic artwork on textiles, on pottery, that travels and sort of mutates in a way that's very distinct from, say, biological mutation. So when we're looking at species, mutation can only happen with speciation events, when you reproduce offspring. But with each new idea, one person can produce an infinite number of ideas in theory, and they're not confined to the number of, quote, offspring that they have. And they can change those ideas in their lifetime, so they can, quote, mutate in their lifetime. So this is sort of getting far afield into like cladistics, and how it applies to culture change. And that's a whole different topic in of itself, which is really fascinating. I'm reading a book right now from the 60s, of all things, by an art historian, George Kluber, that kind of starts to talk about this concept. So it's just really interesting to see that this idea of understanding culture change has been sort of talked about in different subfields in art history and in linguistics, in archaeology, and sort of talking about the same thing of how can we understand change of culture in a similar fashion that we study change of species. But that's where I'm going to table it for now, so I can get to the last question, so then I can be done in under 60 minutes. Cole asks, I've always wondered about the living arrangements of archaeologists in the field. If a site is in a remote area, how long will an archaeologist stay at the site before heading to town with supplies? Or do they pack supplies for the duration of the excavation and do not rely on local goods? So that's a great question, Cole. And the cop-out answer is it depends. So I would say this sort of romantic view of archaeologists camping out at places is not very common these days, because archaeology is a profession that, much in the same way utilities maintenance people have to get a hotel in places and do their field work, archaeologists oftentimes are going out to if they're getting paid, they're oftentimes going out to projects that are in areas with populations. Even if you're going out to rural Wyoming, you might just have a long commute and a shorter workday. So you might be working a 10-hour workday because there's no quick access, and it might take you. In an ideal world, most archaeologists try to keep the sort of physical hiking distance down to less than a couple miles. What's the nearest spot you can park your car and then walk from there with your equipment. Now, if you're doing a large-scale excavation, like if you're working as a Maya archaeologist in central Yucatan, Mexico, that's a different story, because you have opted to go to this location as opposed to you're being told to go to that location by a contractor or a client who's hired your services. And in those cases, that's up to the researcher, and they have to come up with their own design. And a lot of times there will be a nearby location, like some of these large-scale sites. I'm drawing from the Yucatan as an example because I know a little bit more about Maya archaeology than I do about other parts of the world. But if you're going to Calakmul or Tikal, there's a small village that's still extant in those archaeological sites, and so those are basically base camps, and then you try to do archaeology within those base camps, within a reasonable distance, like I said, within 1 or 2 miles. So the idea that you're going to be bivouacking, as they say, pitching a tent, I don't really think those I'm sure people still do it. I imagine like there are some places that it's just unavoidable, like you're just so far out there. But those sites are usually like so big of a site. Like, I mean, Tikal is not a site that like people are gonna be like, oh, just a couple of people out there in a tent, or like Olduvai Gorge in Kenya, or is it Tanzania? I think it's Tanzania. Um, these are sites that are so important to understanding human history that odds are that you're going to have basically a little tent city. You're going to have like a little Burning Man um, at this archaeological site, and you're going to create a village of archaeologists to study that site. And you'll bring enough supplies that you would be sufficiently supplied for the duration of your trip in those cases. But in most cases, archaeologists tend to, just drive in their car as far as they can, have an off-road vehicle, and then park it as close as they can. It really only applies to, like in the Midwest, there's lots of archaeologists in the Midwest. I mean, yes, I've had to walk a lot for projects, but that's mostly because of the weird shape of the project boundaries and not because they were inaccessible in general. So like a linear pipeline feature that's running across the state of Ohio, it's a very long project, and it becomes tedious because you have to drive around to the next location where that pipeline crosses a road, as opposed to just walking across the whole thing. And so I'm thinking about the logistics of cars and all that stuff. The short answer to your question is, how long will archaeologists stay at a site? It's really project specific. So, if you're there for contract archaeology, it's usually pretty short. If you're there for, say, something like excavating at Tikal, you might spend 3 months at a site, living in a small town and then commuting every once in a while to certain parts of the site. But generally speaking, you don't set up a camp. You're not like living out of a tent. Like, this isn't Indiana Jones, people digging in the desert sort of thing. And if you are, you're going to have the kind of labor power that would basically set up a city in that location. Because if you're in the middle of nowhere, then that site better be pretty darn important for you to spend that much time there. Something like Olduvai Gorge, which has huge amount of human ancestry and human evolution studies that can be done out of Olduvai Gorge. So, of course, they basically have built research facilities. Like, if it's in the middle of nowhere, then you're just going to go ahead and get the money to build a research facility so that you have a pantry, you have a stove, et cetera, et cetera. But in most cases, you just get a hotel or an Airbnb or whatever have you, and you just kind of commute. So that's the last question that I'm going to answer for today. There was at least one or two other questions that came in a little late that I couldn't get to before today's live stream. So what have I learned? Obviously, hopefully, I hope you guys learned something. Hopefully I answered all your questions, and hopefully next week we get some interesting questions that I can talk about and prep more for. Sorry I didn't have fun props this week. I mean, I just had a couple of stone tools, but maybe next week I'll have more props if I have time. Lessons that I learned were I should have a break at 11:30. I should promote other classes where we can talk more about this stuff, and I think those are the main things. Maybe work on getting my Elmo set up. That's the camera. You can't see it, but it's right there. That's the Elmo camera. Get that set up. But yeah, we'll plan on doing this again next Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and again on the 14th of December. So December 7th is the next one. December 14th is the last one for 2023. And then sometime in mid-January, I'll announce when the new weekly live stream schedule is going to be. And if you have questions, just send them to tricanthropology@gmail.com. Or if you're a student in my class and you have my email me, and I will add those questions to the question block, and we will get to them. And if you have comments on other things that you'd like to see out of these live Q&As, because right now they're just answering questions, but if you have anything else that you think would be more interesting about them, so then it's just not me talking, let me know, and I will add them in. But in the meantime, I wish you all well,